What's up everybody, Commander Sanctum here, and today we have a brand new deck tech using Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls. Valgavoth is a 4/4 Elder Demon for 2 red-black that has flying, ward, pay 2 life, and whenever an opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, put a +1/+1 counter on Valgavoth and draw a card. Even though this last ability is limited to once per an opponent's turn, it is still an extremely powerful effect that we can use to our advantage. This deck tech will focus on using this ability to both draw a ton of cards and make Valgavoth huge by doing consistent damage to our opponents on their turns. With that, let's get to the card highlights. To make sure we're getting Valgavoth to trigger each turn, we want cards that will do damage consistently at specific points during our opponent's turns. One such way to do this is with effects that deal damage whenever a card is drawn. Cataract Parasite and Razorkin Needlehead are 2 such cards that will deal 1 damage to an opponent whenever they draw a card. Spiteful Visions will also hurt you whenever you draw, but is nice in that it also gives you an extra card in your draw step. Damage from these will be unavoidable in 99% of scenarios, since each player draws at least 1 card each turn during their draw step, making them ideal candidates to trigger Valgavoth consistently. Not to mention, these types of cards will also keep opponents in line that wheel or draw a ton of cards consistently, punishing them with damage for doing so. Alongside card draw, another way to make our opponents take unavoidable damage is via upkeep triggers. Cards like Barbed Wire and Forsaken Wastes are excellent ways to do this, as they will always do 1 damage on each upkeep, letting you trigger Valgavoth on each opponent's turn before they even make it to their main phase. Sulfuric Vortex achieves this as well, but doing 2 damage instead of 1, helping you rack up the damage even quicker. Forsaken Waste and Sulfuric Vortex are especially good, as they also prevent players from gaining life, effectively shutting down some strategies like life gain. Other ways to force through unavoidable damage include things like the Emblem from Chandra Awakened Inferno, which causes another upkeep damage trigger and can actually stack upon themselves if you activate Chandra's loyalty ability multiple times. Mana Barbs is going to essentially be unavoidable in most scenarios, as most decks are going to require tapping their lands for mana at some point in the turn. Finally, Obsidian Fireheart is probably the most fun way to achieve this damage, as we can literally set our opponent's lands on fire with it. Honestly, any deck that fits the theme of an Obsidian Fireheart should run it in my opinion, and there's not going to be many better than a Valgavoth deck. Pestilence and Pyrohemia are going to be 2 other good sources of consistent damage, although these ones require mana to activate as opposed to being a natural triggered effect. Still, it should be relatively easy in most scenarios to activate this on each opponent's turn, and can double as mass removal of tokens or other smaller creatures if activated enough times in a turn. Beyond the simple damage effects we'll be using to trigger Valgavoth, we'll want other ways to efficiently and quickly kill our opponents. Honestly, since Valgavoth will be getting counters, killing with commander damage is going to be an excellent way to go about this. Some cards that can help us achieve this without having to wait for Valgavoth to get to 17 +1/+1 counters include things like Temur Battle Rage and Unleash Fury, both of which effectively double Valgavoth's power, meaning he'll only need to be at least an 11/11 to kill an opponent outright. Blackblade Reforged is also an efficient way to do this, though will be more noticeable than the other cards since it needs to be attached prior to attacking. In cases where we can't one-shot an opponent, we'll want to make sure that Valgavoth is able to get damage through to our opponents, whittling them down slowly but surely. One way to do this is via Trample. Shadowspear and Loxodon Warhammer are 2 examples of this, both of which buff Valgavoth while giving him Trample and Lifelink. Lifelink will be especially nice, since most of our damage effects also hit us. Just make sure to be wary of the Sulfuric Vortex and Forsaken Wastes mentioned before, as those will prevent Lifelink from working. Tenza Godo's Maul gives Valgavoth an impressive +3/+3 and Trample, making it easier to get our opponents to that 21 commander damage quickly. Another way to make sure we can hit our opponents is with straight up unblockability. Whispersill Cloak and Rogue's Passage are 2 common examples of this, with Whispersill Cloak giving the added benefit of Shroud, making it even harder to spot remove our Valgavoth. Shizo Death Storehouse makes Valgavoth effectively unblockable, unless our opponent has either black or artifact creatures. Still, it's highly likely that at least one of our opponents won't have either of these, allowing us to focus on them until we can find another piece that allows us to hit the others. So far, our main win cons are either Valgavoth himself or the damage effects that trigger Valgavoth, but it would be good to include other things that can help us keep up the pressure on our opponents from a life total perspective. Since we'll be drawing a lot of cards, we can use cards like Psychosis Crawler and Starscream Power Hungry, both of which hurt our opponents when we do draw. Admittedly, Starscream has quite a bit of setup to make it work the way we want to, but with a giant flyer in Valgavoth, getting the Monarch consistently shouldn't be too difficult. We also have Words of Waste, which, while not damaging our opponents, can let us force them to discard cards, depriving them of the most important resource in all of Magic. Finally, we have some utility cards that simply work well with Valgavoth. Fling can be an excellent finisher in cases where we have a giant Valgavoth, but can't attack with him for one reason or another. Repercussion basically acts as another potential damage source to trigger Valgavoth, and can even de-incentivize our opponents from blocking with creatures, since Repercussion will make them take a ton of damage for doing so. Blood for the Blood God is a fun card that can apply the pressure to our opponents even more, since it's even more damage, and can be a good board wipe backup to refill our hand if needed. Here is an example deck list utilizing all the previously mentioned cards. This includes additional damage sources like Isolation Cell and Underworld Dreams, removal that can also act as trigger sources for Valgavoth in Kolaghan's Command and Hellish Rebuke, and a ramp package including Solemn Simulacrum and Expedition Map. Valgavoth can do some serious work in taking out our opponents quickly. Between the damage they'll be taking from the cards meant to trigger Valgavoth's ability and Valgavoth himself, this deck can put some serious pressure on our opponents. Valgavoth's resistance to removal is nothing to scoff at either. While the ward cost is only 2 life, which is pretty paltry in Commander, the fact that doing so will cause us to draw a card may give our opponent pause before snapping off a removal spell. The fact that his ability only triggers once per turn, and only on our opponent's turn, is a bit of a detriment however. This means that, at most, we'll get 3 triggers per turn cycle, and a creature doing combat damage to a player will never trigger the ability, forcing us to rely on our supplementary abilities to get the damage in. You know, there's been a lot of chatter with Valgavoth and how he's just a worse Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin. People have been saying, Ob Nixilis does this same thing but better, so why not just run him? Honestly, there's nothing wrong with running a slightly worse commander in a theme. It adds variety, it lets you run different cards that only work with one commander over the other, and it can be even better from a political perspective, since a less powerful commander is less likely to draw immediate hate. Personally, I find Valgavoth to be the more fun and more interesting commander, so I much prefer him over Ob Nixilis. Does that mean the deck will likely be worse and less efficient? Probably, but that's something I'm fine with. Commander is all about running the sweet cards that you want to play with, not the ones that are considered strictly better. If you have that same mentality and want to do some extreme damage to your opponents while drawing cards, I'd suggest giving Valgavoth a try. I hope you enjoyed watching this deck tech on Valgavoth Harrower of Souls. The full deck list outlined in this video can be found at the Archidect link at the top of the description. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to drop a like and comment, as well as subscribe to the channel for more Magic content. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.